Hey guys, Roman Indian Reaper here. So, as you can see, yep, it is pissing it down. So obviously that is prime cinema going weather, and oh boy, we have a good one in store. I'm about to head in to see Black Phone 2, you know, the big October horror. Been really looking forward to this, you know, I really liked the first film, rewatched it recently, and it still holds up. And this one looks good as well. It's quite an interesting new direction. Obviously the grabber's more like a Freddy type dream killer this time around, which is a really fun direction to take it, and I hope that it delivers. But the only way to find out is to head in, get some snacks, and get seated for Black Phone 2. So I've got my popcorn here, and a red frozen Fanta, colour of blood for the people killed by the grabber, ready for his big return. So, Black Phone 2. I am back from seeing it. This is once again directed by Scott Derrickson and co-written by him and C. Robert Cargill. This is, of course, once again drawn from the short story by Joe Hill. In fact, this whole thing is an idea Hill had to expand on the first. Now, it is reasonable to go into a Black Phone sequel with a certain level of skepticism, because obviously the first film told a pretty contained story, but I went in with an open mind, because, you know, to follow up a fairly standalone tale like that, you'd have to have a pretty rock-solid idea, and obviously coupled with, you know, a lot of the same creative team from the first returning for the sequel, I went in hopeful that they would deliver a worthy follow-up. But is this a worthy sequel to the self-contained story of the first that justifies its existence? Let's find out. So the film is set 4 years after the events of the first, with Finney Blake, now going by Finn, struggling to cope with the traumatic ordeal he faced in the grabber's basement. One day, his younger sister Gwen begins having dreams of a series of brutal murders at Camp Alpine Lake, a Christian youth camp in Colorado's Rocky Mountains. And so, the two siblings head out to the camp to get to the bottom of what happened to the boys. But the pair soon discover that the spirit of the grabber is connected, and he is hell-bent on getting his revenge. So obviously you can argue about the necessity of this film's existence all you want, but in saying that, for a film clearly intended to cash in on the first success, they ended up delivering a very worthy follow-up. Now, I hesitate to say whether it's better or worse than the first, because honestly, the two actually do exist very much of a piece, and honestly, I could see reasonable arguments for preferring either one of the two. Yeah, they really delivered here. To its credit, it isn't just a lazy rehash of the first. Like, obviously it has all the familiar elements from the first, like obviously the phone itself, and Finney communicating with the dead, and of course Gwen's dreams. But they actually take those and, you know, move them in a new direction. Now, admittedly, the first act is kind of slow to get started, but once the central mystery at the Alpine Lake camp, you know, reveals itself, it really shifts into gear, and from there becomes a very gripping watch, you know, with a very tense atmosphere, and they are some really expertly done cinematography, really utilizing the snowy mountain landscape, which actually lends itself to horror very well. In fact, there's actually a jump scare or two here that actually did catch me off guard. It is very, very well done. You know, this time around, obviously the first film dipped its toes into supernatural with the dreams and the phone itself, but here they fully lean into that as, you know, they expand on those elements, you know. Gwen's dreams are very much, the central point of the story this time around. And we actually learn a bit more about Finney and Gwen's mother and her dreams. We even get a little bit of backstory for the grabber. It really expands on the first in very, very interesting ways. But as well as the supernatural stuff, it very much plays itself as a bit of a slasher as well, a bit like, yes, Nightmare on Elm Street. And that stuff, I gotta say, is really, really well done. The kills here are brutal and gnarly and really well executed. They very much lean into the fact the brutal nature of the violence here. It is a lot more violent than the first, and yeah, you can definitely tell this got an 18 rating compared to the 15 of the first here in the UK, and they very much lean into that, and it works. But as well, obviously, as it moves the story in a new direction, it actually does stay true to the sort of roots of the first film. Obviously, it has those moments of humor sprinkled in, particularly from sort of Gwen and her, very foul mouth, butting heads with the workers at this Christian youth camp. But it also stays true to the sort of interesting thematic core of the first, very much building on that to sort of give us an interesting look at how the survivors of horrific events like, yes, child kidnapping, cope and deal with the traumatic ordeals they went through. Is very, very interesting stuff, and it is in service of some very interesting character development for particularly for Finney and Gwen. And the acting here is very, very good as well. Obviously, Mason Thames is great once again as Finney. Obviously, fresh off taking Toothless for a test drive. I very much enjoyed his arc. I've become, he's a more hardened character now, very much as a sort of coping mechanism. And I found how that played out to be really, really interesting. And I think, Mason really sells it. He's really broken through of recent for a reason, because he absolutely has absolutely has great presence here. Madeline McGraw is great as Gwen. In fact, this is very much just as much Gwen's story as it is Finney's. In fact, probably even more so, as we very much see how these very real dreams affect her. And also, more tense relations with Finney, I guess, again, as a result of the first, she is great here, and, the sort of, sibling relationship, really plays very well here. A character I really enjoyed here is the character of Armando, the camp leader, played by Damien Bashir, who actually is quite a supportive presence, and, very much supports the two in their investigation of these dead boys. And actually, he's a really wonderful character. I very much liked him. And we also have Jeremy Davies back from the first as Finney and Gwen's dad, who in a very interesting arc is actually trying to give up the drinking. Very a very interesting expansion on that character from the first. But of course, it's no surprise that the scene stealer, yes, once again, is Ethan Hawke as the grabber. I mean, admittedly, he is kind of sidelined for a lot of it, but when he is on screen, as this, Freddy Krueger-esque dream killer, he is great. He's every bit as genuinely menacing as he was before. He is fantastic, and his scenes really leave an impact. You can just see Hawke really relishing the chance to play this villainous role once again. And of course, it's been, because of this, very interesting character stuff, and again, the gripping, tense atmosphere of its plot, it really keeps itself moving, very much keeps itself engaging and exciting throughout, building to an absolutely glorious ice skating climax that is very much very much where the peak of the film. It just builds and builds and builds. And that final act is easily the best part of the whole thing. It is a delight. And it actually wraps things up in very interesting ways. You know, again, wraps it up on another fairly contained note. But honestly, apparently the creatives like, yes, Derrickson and Hawke are open to a third film. So, yeah, if they have a good idea for where they want to take the story next, honestly, I'd be open to to see more of the phone. I'd happily answer it once again. Overall, the Black Phone 2 is a very, very worthy follow-up to the first, delivering a tense and violent atmosphere that expands on the first in very interesting ways. Out of 10, Black Phone 2 gets an 8. So let me know down in the comments, have you seen Black Phone 2? What did you think of it? Which of the two do you prefer out of the first or the second? And would you be open to a third film? Let me know all that down in the comments. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you're new. And don't forget to turn on post notifications so you don't miss an upload.